1:30-ish. So let's go ahead and we'll get started on this. And as always, thank you very much for being here. So look forward to when we can get past the Zoom stage and actually see real live people, because I miss my peeps. It's a real challenge. And be patient with me as we go through the Zoom and all. And please know that just like in my live classes, I'm very open to questions and comments because we learn from each other. And the crux of these classes, particularly the advanced classes, which is what this one is that we address and we deal with things that have been happening with us, with our market center, things that I experienced maybe with another office, like maybe my Rockwall office. And it brings up something that we've got to address and we need to deal with. And it's something that, we want to make sure that we're able to help everybody think through these procedures and be a resource for the client. And sometimes you're being a resource for the client is letting them know the limitations you have and whatever it is you can do. So we're going to start off and we'll talk about demand procedures. Many of you have had this. We certainly in just the past, and we go through cycles, but in the past 2-3 weeks, certainly since the last class, we've had, oops, what happened?
Hello.
Hello, I just lost everybody.
Yeah, hang on a minute. I'm trying to mute myself on Bob's class. Okay, will do. Okay.
I still hear you, Bob.
Okay, but where did I go?
I don't know. I see you too, but I just see James, Bivens, and you.
Mine says that Pat Parada is sharing his screen.
Well, don't do that, Pat. So
You're still in the meeting. Close out of this.
okay, well, close this.
Sorry, you're not on mute.
Somebody's talking over this.
As James said, I've got an indication here. It says you are viewing, I guess it's Prasada's screen. So I see a sign in and a Zoom.
Yeah, he's starting. He just wrote it in mine. Can you hear me? It's Prasada at
Yes, I can.
kw.com.
Yep, I see him in there. I don't know why that's there.
Whoa, and he's taking control.
Can't have him be the host.
Somebody's taken over. They just took over my screen. Oh, wow.
And on Palmer and Cliff, I think we're going to have
Now it says this site can't be reached. Do you guys see that?
and what kind of terms they want to do for. Oh, okay. Yeah. I've already been through everything now.
We're back.
Here we go.
Participant sharing. clicked on that. Okay,
How are you?
I think we just finally picked Suze from the meeting. We give her somehow details for the Zoom.
okay. Can everybody hear me and see me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good.
Yes, we can.
I don't know what happened with
hear you.
Pat all of a sudden jumping in and almost getting a co-host role. So we'll work through this. Okay, so back to I was talking about the demand situation, and we'll take it from both directions. You represent the seller, and closing has already happened. Sometimes this will come up, and it was last week, last month, last year. And what happens is you represent the seller, and maybe you'll hear from the seller, or maybe you'll hear from the other agent. Maybe you'll hear from the buyer. And what's happened is the buyer, after closing, has discovered a problem. Whatever it happens to be. They discovered there's a foundation problem, a roof problem, the roof is leaking, there's a problem with the heating ducts, something that they say, you know what, this wasn't there, this problem wasn't there before we closed. We feel like the seller didn't disclose this, and clearly the seller must have known about it. I'll give you an example. I think I saw her on the call, although I won't call her name. We have one recently. We have a seller, and the buyer has determined that they have mold in their HVAC, in their ducts. And so they got, a HVAC company out there, and they say, oh, yeah, this takes a long time for this to develop. There's no question the seller would have known about it. And so the buyer is making a demand of the seller, and actually of anybody, of both agents, to fix this problem. And so when we represent the seller and something like that pops up, the call that I get from you, and I do get the call, what do? Well, first thing we need to understand, above everything else, this is a buyer-seller issue. Buyer and seller. We've closed. We have no authority in this transaction. Now, we're not going to abandon our client. We'll support our client with whatever documents we have in our possession that will help them. We will immediately, if it's a demand letter, if it's something that even implies potential litigation, in any case, when the buyer's saying, hey, seller, you're responsible, you didn't represent this, and you need to take care of this, we will advise our client to seek legal advice. And we'll do that in writing, such as an email, because if there's any potential litigation coming up, we need to have some legal advice in working through this. Okay. And do that. One of the things that we help our seller understand, and this example that I'm just throwing out is a good example. Most people, when they live in a house, even for an extended period of time, unless they've had a problem and unless they do work on their HVAC, on their ducts, they don't know what's up there. They don't know if it's clean or if it's dirty. It's one of those things that on a regular basis, most owners don't have their ducts cleaned. They probably should. But if they've had it serviced, if they've had it cleaned, then they've got information. But in most cases, they don't have any information. They didn't know that there was mold. They didn't know that there's something that's been developing over the years. And so if the seller didn't have any information, didn't work on their ducts, didn't do anything, there's no information. There's not anything for the seller to disclose. And the problem is, and this is a good example, buyers, when they buy a house, particularly buy a pre-owned house, they have this expectation that when they close, everything is fine. Everything is working, everything's in good shape. Anything that's not perfect the seller would have fixed or our inspector would have found something and we would have negotiated repairs. And that's the expectation. It's almost like the buyer is thinking they're getting a brand new house, that everything is perfect. Well, that's just not the case. That's really not what's happening. The reality is you buy a house, a pre-owned house, your inspection is fine, you've negotiated repairs with the seller, everything is doing good, and literally the day after closing, your air conditioning totally goes out. Well, it happens. You know, it could have happened right then, it could have happened a year later, could have happened, you know, that happens. But there's this sense of entitlement of many buyers who say, whoa, wait a minute, whose fault is this? Can't be my fault, can't be me, has to be somebody else who's responsible. So how do I make sure they do it? Now, in the example that I am using here, when the buyer, the new owner, had an HVAC company go out, they do what many vendors do, particularly if they're going to charge money to fix the problem. Say, yeah, we've got we've got something here that's going to really help out, and it's going to cost about $3,000. And so to help encourage the buyer to buy that service, you're saying, oh, by the way, your seller should have told you about this. They certainly would have known. So you need to have them pay for this. And they do that not because they're bad people, but that's the tendency for them to delay this, help the seller or help the buyer, new owner, lay it off on somebody else. And that's why they'll come after our seller. That's why they'll say, hey, what's going on here? You know, you clearly knew about this, you didn't disclose it. And non-disclosure of material information is a very serious accusation. And if it can be proven, serious liability, to the point that, you know, in some cases, we've got one right now we're dealing with in one of the other offices, and the buyer's request in this is they want the entire sale rescinded. They want all their money back. They want the seller to take the house back, and they want all their money back, everything that they spent in buying this. They say, you know what, if we just known all this information, would have never bought it. That's significant. That's a huge liability, huge cost. But that happens. So when you get the call from the seller, and the seller says, hey, I just got a call from, or I just got a registered letter from, and it's from the buyer or it's from their attorney, what do? So what's your first instructions or response to your seller when they call you up and say, hey, this is happening and what do I do now? What's your thought? I'll give you a minute to unmute yourself.
Consult an attorney.
Absolutely. Say, well, first of all, because this could potentially be a legal issue, you need to seek legal advice. You need to have counsel. The other thing we want to tell them is pull together all your information. We had, in fact, it was the largest lawsuit we've had in the Plano office. Started out at 1.6 million. It came down a little bit, but it took 3 years to resolve it. It finally got resolved right before it went to court. And it turns out our client, the seller, finally realized and owned up to the fact that he did have information that he didn't disclose. And he finally owned up to it. It cost our seller $400,000 because of what he failed to disclose. So when your seller says, here's what's happened, what do I do? Well, first of all, seller, you need to think through the situation. You need to look at your seller's disclosure notice. You need to look at your documents. You need to see if you've ever had ducts worked on. You know, you need to see if you've had a situation where there's some kernel of truth in what these buyers are complaining about. You need to help your seller pull together all files. Now, they may not have everything, and you may need to provide them with some of your documents, inspections, seller's disclosure, things that you may have in your possession that could help them, and you'll provide those. But in a very supportive, nice way, you know, to say, you know what, I'll be happy to act as a conduit back and forth, providing information. You know, I've got things in my possession may help you, but Mr. Seller, I didn't take you on to raise you. This is a buyer-seller issue. And what you're going to find yourself doing is dealing with the buyer. I'll help you through the process. You know, we've been through this. We understand how this all works. But they've got to understand we have no authority on what the other side does. I mean, none. And the challenge with that, and I see this over and over again, our client kind of looks at us as that safety net that we can fix the problem. And sometimes they see us as fixing the problem with money, with our money, which means your money. And we want to avoid that. We don't want to go down that road. We need to help them understand that the buyer is filing some complaint, some demand, something against you, the seller. You seek legal counsel. You need to pull all your docs together. You need to respond. We'll help act as a conduit. Yes, question.
But Chantel,
Yeah.
this is not, I am not the agent on either side of this, but this happened with a woman that I did put in the neighborhood, and she's watching all this. So of course,
What do you mean you put into the neighborhood?
oh, she was my buyer, and she's in the neighborhood, but the house next door went under contract as well. And they see that once they put it on there, there was a water leak, and there was water running.
Okay, slow down, Chantel. I'm missing you.
Okay.
Once who put on what?
They put the house on the market, I guess the agent,
Okay.
and the buyer comes in with her agent and they buy it, and they find out after the fact there is a leak, and it's already a closed deal, not my deal. I have no skin in this game.
So how did you find out about it?
Pardon?
How did you find out what was going on?
The next door neighbor was my client. I put her in a home next door. She's done, and that was last year. But
Okay.
she said that they watched as neighbors the water run out of this house.
Okay, so the
and
house
the
that you were not involved in, your neighbor's not involved in, it was a different deal. And she says water was running out of the house. Okay.
But my question is, I found out that there was multiple offers on this property, and the young couple that bought it decided to take it as is. And now they want to go back saying none of that was disclosed. Now, I'm just putting it out there because I think this is something we all need to know. And if you put a house on the market and they say there's multiple offers and they go, okay, well, in order, we'll take it as is. Even if we do an inspection, we will take this home as is, just to get in there.
Okay, so
What happened?
let's clarify something first. Every residential contract that Trek has is an as-is contract.
Right.
They are all as-is. It says so in paragraph 7. They are as-is contracts. The element that you're adding to it, the buyer and their eagerness to be able to get the contract and do it says, you know, we're buying this as-is. We're not going to ask for repairs. We're going to do inspection just so we have information. That doesn't change anything. That does not change the seller's requirement to disclose. Being an as-is, where is, I don't know nothing transaction does not relieve the seller from disclosing everything they know about the condition of the property. So the buyer later, when they discover things the seller knew and failed to disclose, the buyer doesn't lose any of their rights to sue the seller because it was an as-is transaction.
Right.
So that doesn't relieve, any liability. Your seller, if you represent a seller, sometimes your seller will say, you know what, at this price, this is as is. And you need to say, well, you need to know every contract at whatever price, every residential contract using Trek forms in Texas, you're all as is. What you're telling me, seller, is if you're going to sell this property to this buyer at this price, you're not going to do any repairs. And sometimes your seller will say, I want to see that in the contract. I want to see you say something in special provisions that the seller will not do any repairs. Now, seller can instruct you. That's kind of a business detail, and that's fine. It does not mean the buyer doesn't do inspections, does not mean the buyer can't request
Right.
repairs.
Absolutely.
It just means one of the key points here we need to understand, because it's an as-is transaction, the seller is not obligated to do any repairs at all, period. Now, the transaction may go away, buyer may terminate, but the buyer can't say, well, if you don't do these repairs, we're going to terminate. Well, the seller not agreeing to repairs is not a basis for termination. It may be the reason they're going to terminate during an option period or maybe HOA period, something like that. But there is no obligation under any circumstances for the seller to do any repairs unless they've agreed to in the contract. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Now, sometimes it's valuable. Sometimes the reason a seller will go ahead and say, I want this buyer to know, they can inspect to their heart's content. They can ask all they want to ask. I'm just not going to do repairs. And it may be the seller went through that in another transaction and they say, you know what? I think a buyer would appreciate being warned ahead of time that we're not going to do any repairs. Some buyers say, I spent money on option, inspections, appraisal. I'd really been nice to know you weren't going to negotiate at some level with us. So the seller says, I think it's prudent, I think it's fair for me to tell them, hey, we're not going to do anything. And so that's sometimes why you'll see that added language and special provisions.
But can that be brought up after the fact, after it's closed and they discover something that was not on the seller's disclosure, even though they...
So one of the things that we are going to talk about, and it's actually one of the things that we kind of talk about, and it's a little bit of this, we're actually going to talk about the seller's disclosure notice. Here's the challenge with seller's disclosure, and we're going to talk more about it 2 items down, but here's the concept of the seller's disclosure. Not just the seller's disclosure, but any manner of disclosure. When a buyer says, here's something after the fact, I think the seller knew, and I think the seller should have disclosed it. And it's true. If the seller had information, then you disclose it, whether it's as is or not, doesn't matter. The challenge the buyer has is proving what the seller knew and when they knew it. Now, sometimes that's incredibly hard. Sometimes it's not possible at all. The other challenge is we need for our seller to recognize it's a very, very small world out there. One of the lawsuits we ended up settling, and we came out fine in it because we really didn't do anything wrong. But what had happened is a buyer bought the property and everything was fine. And then the buyer began to discover 2 years after closing, some foundation problems. And I say, wow, man. And so the buyer asked neighbors, who's a good foundation company? Who should I talk to? And everybody came up with a couple of names. And the buyer's the new owner, there for 2 years, called this foundation company. There are a ton of foundation companies out there. They call this foundation company that happened to be the same foundation company that did work for the seller when they owned it. And the foundation company, as they sometimes say, and they did at this point, they kind of changed their tune later in depositions. But the foundation company guy says, oh yeah, we were out here 2 years ago or a year ago, and we found this, this, and this, and the seller just didn't want to do anything about it. Didn't they tell you? Didn't the seller tell you about that? Because they clearly knew. Too small a world. People will call the one plumber out of 500 plumbers that worked on this thing last week. That's just how that happens. So we need to understand. But the challenge for the buyer is proving what the seller knew and when they knew it. And if they can prove up the seller really knew something and failed to disclose it, there's a lot of liability for the seller. And we've got to help advise our sellers to do that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get in the seller's disclosure notice. But to your specific question, Chantel, if this happened after the fact that the buyer bought it as is doesn't change the buyer's rights at all. It may end, if it ends up in court, a judge may give a little, say, well, you had your opportunities, so forth and so on. But the reality is, doesn't take away their rights. And so the buyer can look at what the seller had in the seller's disclosure. And the buyer said, wow, they didn't say anything about this leak. And clearly as we've talked to the plumbers, they knew about this leak and told the seller. So we think the seller clearly knew something and failed to disclose it. And if that's the case, buyer has some rights there to move forward. How the buyer moves forward is entirely their decision. How far they want to take it. It's rare for a buyer to actually go to a lawsuit, go to litigation. It's not rare for them to threaten that. That kind of demand, threatening litigation happens a lot. But once they really get to looking at the cost of litigation, the chance of success, as a general rule, it's better to try to mediate, come to some settlement, and compromise and work something out. Because if you go to court, I don't care who wins, you lose. It never turns out good. So you just want to avoid that if at all possible. Does that kind of help with that, Chantel? A little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So that's from the seller side. Seller calls you, hey, I've got this demand letter, this whatever from the buyer. What do I do? 1, legal advice. 2, pull together all your information, all the things that have happened that specifically, are related to this specific thing. The buyer saying, well, the roof leaks now. Between the house and the patio is the same, and roof leaks, and we think seller probably knew about that. So the seller needs to look at what they know about that, what information they have, because they need to be able to respond to a buyer point by point and say, here's why this is not true. Here's what we did know. Here's what we did disclose. Here's what we did not disclose because, frankly, we didn't know it. The range of what people know about the home they live in, even for 20 years, the range of what they know is enormous. Think about the situation. And we had this. We had the buyer on it. One of my agents had the buyer. The seller was a salesman, and he was with a big company. He travels a lot. He was gone from the house virtually every week, Monday through Friday. He wasn't there day in and day out. He had people come in and clean the house. So he didn't have that sense of what's going on with the house day in and day out. So there are a lot of things that he simply didn't know about the property. Versus this other seller, this other owner, who's a family with 3 kids who lived there from day one of the property, and they're there day in and day out, running the washer and the dryer and doing this and that and so forth. They know more. They know different things. So there can't be a presumption that, gee, if you live in the house for 20 years, you clearly have to know everything about the property. Not the case. We probably should keep a logbook on everything that happens to our house. Every dime we spend, every repair we make, everything we do, because it's a really important thing. As a general rule, 90% of us don't. I mean, I don't even do it, and I know better, but it's just how that is. So from a seller standpoint, that's the advice you're going to be. You're going to say, I'll be happy to support you or whatever I can, but Mr. Seller, you need to know, I have no authority over the other side. I have no control over it. This is going to be between you and the buyer, and each of you are going to have to do whatever it is you want to do. Any questions from the seller side before we go to the buyer side of demand? We good? Okay, so going to the buyer side of the try and pull this up. Okay, so you've got a handout there in the email, and past the contract, I've got some information on seller disclosure. I've got the steps of a demand procedure. So when you have the buyer is your client, and they bought a house, and now a week later, a month later, a year later, whatever, they say, hey, here's a problem. What do we do about it? We think that the seller should have known about this, didn't disclose it, and we got all kinds of problems. It's going to cost $5,000 to fix it. What do we do? These are the steps of a demand procedure, and there's 6 steps. And this is what we can give to our buyer and say, here's kind of a track to run on. Here's what you can make use of to decide how to move forward. And when you look at this, the step 1, first thing the buyer's got to do, when they call you, hey, we got this thing, it's going to, say, whoa, slow down. First, you've got to define the nature of the problem. What is the problem? Well, the roof leaks. Okay. So the roof leaks. So as you go through the process, that's your problem. Roof leaks, or we got cracks all over the house with the foundation, we got window seals, whatever it happens to be. Then you go to the second step. What will it take to resolve the problem, including cost of anything? It says, well, the roof leaks. Well, have you had an expert out? Have you had a roofer out to determine why the roof leaks? What's going on? Plus, here is the nature of that problem. Here's why the roof leaks. And this is what's going to take to fix the roof so it won't leak. And this is what's going to cost. So the buyer, one, is determined, here's the problem. Number two, what's it going to take to fix the problem, including the cost. And many times when a buyer calls you, when your client calls you, they've already done these first two steps. They've kind of already gone through that process. And so they already have a sense on what it's going to take to do it because they've already had the roofer out or the foundation company out or whatever. Thank you. And so this takes us to the third step. And the buyer has probably implied when they called you, and hopefully they didn't call you, their agent, the buyer's agent, say, hey, we got this problem here. How come you didn't tell us about it? Hopefully their initial, conversation with you is not to blame you for anything. Because the third step of this is the buyer needs to decide who they feel is responsible for resolving the problem and why. If they feel like it's a disclosure issue, they say, well, we think this is something the seller clearly knew about, and we think they're responsible, and we think they're responsible because of this. Here's why we think they're responsible. It's not on the seller's disclosure notice. They should have disclosed it. And so as a result of that, here's why we think they're responsible. I'm doing a case now where I'm an expert witness in it, and I'm representing people on the seller side, or at least that's the expert witness part of it. And the buyer's complaint in the situation is they're saying the seller knew certain things and the seller did not disclose these things in the seller's disclosure notice. We'll talk a little bit more about this in just a few minutes when we get into the seller's disclosure notice itself. But it involved, an issue related to the seller's disclosure notice. And, there are several in Section 3 that talk about prior fires, prior foundation work, prior roof work, things of that nature. And it creates an obligation of the seller if they have information, in this particular case it was foundation, if they had information about foundation work on the property, they need to disclose it. And so this whole case is going to go around and revolve around if the seller in fact did know there was prior foundation work and failed to disclose it. And we'll talk about it when we get into the seller disclosure itself. So third step, buyer says, here's who I think is responsible. And 99% of the time say it's the seller. Sometimes it's the buyer's inspector, but they may say it's the seller. And so they say, here's who I think is responsible, and here's why I think. Your buyer client needs to go through that process and deal with that and have a good sense of it. So who do I have that's not muted? And we will go through that. So any questions so far as we go through? We're on the third step now. Buyer, you have to help your buyer think through this. Say, you know what? Because if they're going to move forward with any kind of litigation, they're going to have this exact same conversation with their attorney. Their attorney is going to set up a basis for why they think somebody's responsible and how they're going to move forward against them. So we good with the first three steps? Questions on that? Fourth step. Buyer's going to send a demand letter based on the information from the first three steps. It can be a demand letter from the buyer themselves. It can be a demand letter that the buyer has an attorney do, which is step 5. A buyer may say, you know what, this is a serious enough issue that I want some clout behind it. I want them to see that I'm ready to go to court and ready to sue them. So I'm going to have an attorney do the demand letter. Most of the time, the buyer will send over an email or something from the buyer themselves with their own demand, their own information. And they certainly can do that in step 4. Or they can go right to step 5 and say, hey, you know what? I think this is more serious than just me sending it. I want an attorney to do it. That's their choice. They get to decide which way they're going to go. And then the last step is if they don't get any good resolution, any good responses, cooperation from the seller, then take legal action under advice of counsel. Their attorney will help them decide, here's where you're going to go with this. Sometimes it's an issue that can be dealt with in small claims court if it's something that's $10,000 or less. If it's more than that or it's more complicated, then it's going to go straight to district court. If the client is going to sue someone in district court, they're going to have an attorney. You don't have to have an attorney in small claims court, although maybe you should have. It just depends on the nature of it. So you're going to go through those steps. The great thing about this procedure is when your buyer calls you and say, I got this problem. I think this happened. I think the seller knew about it, didn't do anything about it. What do we do? Get their email, send them these steps, say, here's something for you to run on. And so go through this process. Look at these what you want them to do is look at these first 3 steps, do what you need to do, put all the information together, what the problem is, cost, who you think is responsible, why, do all that so we can see how you want to move forward with the demand letter. This is great because the buyer now has something they know, here's something I can do. Here's what I can do to move forward on this. And again, we need to help our buyer understand we have no authority over the seller side of the transaction. This as closing, we have no authority. We'll act as a conduit. But for the buyer side, we've got this form, this procedure we can give them that kind of helps them a little bit more see that we're really on board with helping them out. Questions on the demand procedure? Before I go into the seller's disclosure notice itself, I always like to give you a little bit of time to unmute yourself and have a question. You ready? Are you good? You ready to go to the seller's disclosure notice itself? Say yes, Bob? Yes, Bob. Okay, now, in your packet, one of the things you have, it's right after the steps of the demand procedure, is the one-page form out of section 5.008 Texas Property Code. And it sets forth the obligation of the seller of residential property comprising not more than 1 dwelling unit. First of all, for the seller's disclosure notice under 5.008 to apply, it has to be residential, not commercial, residential, and not more than 1 dwelling unit. So if the seller is selling a 4-plex or a triplex, selling that whole thing to one buyer, technically the property code does not require the seller to complete a seller's disclosure notice. We do. Our policy is, hey, I know you're selling the whole triplex all one time to whatever buyer can come along. Our policy is we want you to complete a seller's disclosure notice for each unit. Because what happens is somebody doesn't buy all 3 units. Somebody comes along and makes an offer on 1 unit, and they will then need to have a seller's disclosure notice. So we need to already have that done. So this establishes here's what they have to do. Now, when you look in this form on this one page, and you look at paragraph B, it's got a little site there. And what you've got there, if you were to click on that and pull it up, it is the exact 4-page seller's disclosure notice that's approved by the Texas Real Estate Commission. No one has a promulgated seller's disclosure notice form. It's approved. And so this particular form, there's 4 pages now. It used to be 3 pages, 4 now because they added all the flood information. This is the minimum that the seller is required to do. Now, our policy in our office is that we want the seller to use the seller's disclosure that's created by Texas Realtors. It's a 6-page form, and it has the minimum that's required under the property code, and it has several things added to it. It would be very prudent for you to understand the difference between these 2 forms. So when you're on a listing and you get to this where you want the seller to complete this, you need to know Here's why it's a benefit to you, the seller, to complete this more, this longer form that has more questions in it. Just right off the top of your head, when you look at this, there are some key things in here that just point out immediately what's different about this, what's an advantage about this over the shorter form. So let's go to the next thing in your packet, which is the Texas Realtor Seller's Disclosure. And there's some really key things that you need to make note of. Right here on the first section, on the first page, where it works through it, right under where it says Section 1, property has the items marked below. And it gives 3 choices, yes, no, or unknown. So the seller has total flexibility. If seller, so I'm not even sure, I know what that is, but I don't think we have one of those. Well, that's why you got unknown, check unknown. But you'll notice the language right beneath where the Section 1 says, this notice does not establish the items to be conveyed. The contract will determine which items will and will not convey. There may be things that the seller says, right now, as I complete the seller disclosure notice, here's what's there. Here, in my opinion, is what's there. Here's my knowledge of what's there. But the seller in the contract in paragraph 2D could exclude some things. You say, no, this is not included. I'm going to take this with me. So things on this list aren't telling a buyer, you get all these things. Seller's saying, this happens to be there. So we'll look as we negotiate the terms of the contract, what you get and what you don't get. For example, outdoor grill. Seller may say, we're going to take that outdoor grill with us. We're going to take this, that, and the other. They get to make that decision. They get to go through that process. We're going to take the TV antenna with us. We're going to take all the window screens with us. They can exclude anything that doesn't affect the structural integrity of the property. So that's something that language is not in the 4-page TREC form. It's in the 6-page Texas Realtor form. And I think that's important language. The other thing is you look through this, we ask questions. We talk about, for example, satellite dish and controls, security systems, solar panels, owned or leased. You don't have that in the TREC form. It's important for a buyer to know. While I'm on this subject kind of semi, let's just talk for a minute about solar panels. Huge challenge, potential challenge with solar panels. If they're outright owned by the seller, not financed, not leased, but owned, they paid cash for them and they're there. Seller can totally decide whether or not they're going to leave them or take them and go through that process. However, if they're on a lease, this can be a huge challenge. The range of what's in the solar panel leases, 20-year leases, not all the solar panel leases are leases that when you're through with the term of the lease, you now own the solar panels. Some of them, you never own the panels. All you do is continue a lease in perpetuity. Never own them. And the terms of those leases are significant. Sometimes the leases have significant prepayment penalties. That if you pay it off within the first 5 years, then you're now liable, you're the seller liable for the entire amount of the lease, for the entire 20-year amount, which could be $35,000, $40,000. So if you are going to take a listing and there's solar panels, you've got to have that seller provide you with a copy of the lease, which you're not going to interpret. You're not a solar panel lease expert, but your seller needs to get some good advice on this. Many times a seller doesn't even understand the terms of those leases. And so the seller needs to understand what he can do or not do. If the seller has only been in the property 3 or 4 years, and if he sells this property to a buyer, he may have a lease that can be assumed. But if a buyer says, no, I don't want the solar panels. I want to buy your house. I'll pay you the $500,000 you're asking, but I don't want the solar panels. Seller then needs to know what it's going to cost them if this buyer is not assuming this lease. And so you're going to have to tell your seller, you've got some homework to do here on the solar panels, because we're going to have to let potential buyers know what's going on. And any serious buyer is going to want to see a copy of the lease so their attorney can review it. And they can see what would be involved if they really do go ahead and assume that lease. Because the buyer's not required to assume the lease, but the cost may be so prohibitive to the seller that he just can't sell it to a buyer that doesn't assume the lease. So you want to be really careful when you're going to take a listing and solar panels are there. It can be a huge challenge. There can be a lot of benefit in solar panels. It could help us with our footprint and all those wonderful things, but the reality is you've got to be very careful. If you've got the buyer and they're buying a property with solar panels, and you need to find, and if it says on sales disclosure it's a lease from, your buyer needs a copy of that lease. You need to be able to have their attorney review it. So while they're still during the option period, they can make a decision whether or not they're willing to buy this house, assuming this lease for these solar panels. So regardless of which side you're on, this is a significant issue that you need to be prepared to deal with. Any questions on the solar panel issues? Now, Section 3, which is a really important catch-all section, and it's one of several sections that the language of the question, it's an awareness question, not a fact question. Section 1 was a fact question. What's here, what's new here, what you don't know. In Section 3, you've got a yes or a no. But it doesn't mean yes, it's yes, here's the situation. It means yes, I'm aware, no, I'm not aware. And there are a number of items that are previous items. You look in that first column where it talks about previous foundation repairs. If the seller is aware of previous foundation repair, and not just repairs they've done, but maybe a previous owner, then you disclose that. It doesn't matter if the problem has been fixed, it's been cured, there's a warranty, everything's done. If they have information on previous repairs, you need to disclose it. That's an awareness question. Same thing with roof repairs, same thing with other structural repairs. Had a garage enclosed to become a den or something like that. So they need to do that. One of the challenges in the second column here, settling soil movement. I don't even know if I would have a really good definition for settling. Many structural engineers, many foundation companies say there's not a house in the DFW area that hasn't experienced some settling, some soil movement. That's just a fact of our highly plastic soil in our area. I mean, unless you've got a house that's built on a solid rock, you're probably going to have that. But it doesn't mean the seller has to say, well, yes, because just by the very definition must be, seller is not a foundation company expert or anything. They need only say, here's what I know, and they need what I'm aware of. You've got to be very careful as you go through not to try to define it for them. Further down that column, where it talks about termites, it asks about active infestation of termites or the wood destroying insects. It's not asking the seller if there are termites. It's asking the seller if they are aware of termites. And there's a big difference. Does everybody agree there's a big difference? And I don't even know what a termite looks like, so I can't be aware. I don't know. Doesn't mean I don't have termites. It's just I don't know. And clearly, if you know you had damage, if you know you've had treatments, that's a yes or a no. I mean, if you know that, you've got to disclose it. Otherwise, but you can't have a buyer look at this, and when the seller checks off on active infestation, know. Okay, buyer can say, oh boy, thank goodness, I was worried about termites. I'm glad to know there are no termites here. Well, you don't know that. It's not what the seller said. So it just doesn't know. So it is not aware. It's worked through it.
I have a question
Yes, ma'am.
on the previous foundation repair.
Yeah,
Let's say someone buys a home. It's not indicated there was previous foundation repair by that seller. Let's say they are having.
it was or was
some-
not. It was not indicated.
It was not indicated.
Okay,
They move in the house and let's say they notice some movement and let's say they're having a new kitchen floor put in, you know, some remodel work and see where there's been piers. Okay, so does that particular owner now, because of some of the remodeling work and can see evidence that there's piers that would put places, do they have to then, because they discovered it through remodeling, do they have to check the box previous foundation repairs?
yes. Because they now know from their expert, and what will happen is if they notice there appears things that were added, they'll have a foundation company come out and take a look at it and give them their opinion on it. One of the first things that we'd probably suggest that our new owner do is call the seller and say, you know what, I'm not accusing anything here, but I noticed that you didn't say there were previous foundation repairs. Clearly there have been, so we're presuming it was from a previous owner. So do you know or not know about that? Or, you know, so the buyer can decide, the new owner can decide how far they want to go with this. But if they have information from an expert, foundation company, engineer, the people who come out doing the floor, hey, you know, you've had foundation work here.
Mhm.
They now have knowledge of something they have to disclose, even though it's not foundation work they've done, maybe not even foundation work that the previous seller has done, but
Okay.
someone way in the past. You got properties in Highland Park that are 100 years old. And at some point in time in the early 1900s had foundation work. There may be evidence of that now, but nobody has any memory anywhere of when that was done. But if you've got information now that, hey, at some point in this 100-year history of this house and on Armstrong in Highland Park, you say, well, I now have something I need to disclose. Now, you're going to do it in a positive manner. So, you know, here's the information I have, and this is all it is, and we're just trying to be transparent here to help the buyer feel better about what the seller's doing. But if you have knowledge, even though whether anything you did or people you bought it from did, but somebody 2 or 3 owners back
Mhm.
60 years ago, you have to disclose it. There's really no downside to disclosing that. The only potential downside, there are some buyers, and in my mind, foolish buyers, who say, I don't want to buy any house that has ever had any foundation work. And there are many buyers that I just don't want to have that at all. Well, that's foolish because 90% of all the houses in our area at some point in time will have foundation problems. Here we have one that has happened. They found out about it and they fixed it. This is a house that's better than a house next door. They just haven't found out about it yet. But that's the only downside is some buyers say, hey, I don't care what happened 60 years ago. I don't want a house with foundation problems. You know, that's the only potential. The bigger thing is if you don't disclose something, they can use that against the seller in the future. So answer Deborah, yeah, they need to disclose it.
Okay, because you know, you can go several years in a home and you're starting to do remodel work and
Mm-hmm.
things come up that you don't want to go back 5 years prior and, you know, call the former seller, you know. But anyway, thank you.
You're welcome, absolutely. So as we continue in the seller's disclosure notice, and this is the Texas Realty one that that our policy is that's what our sellers should do.
Hey, Bob.
Yes, question.
Bob, a quick
Yes.
question for you. Brian to look at, with regard to seller's disclosure and wood destroying insects, is an example of not knowing that there are wood destroying insects, say someone who is not ambulatory and doesn't know what the exterior of the house looks like or hasn't seen any evidence of it? Is that the only way that?
Well, that could be one. That could be one reason they don't know. They've not had anything done. They've not had a company come out or whatever. So, Brian, there are all kinds of reasons why a seller might not know. What's really important is the seller just needs to be honest in their disclosure. And the buyer needs to understand the nature of that disclosure is not a fact question. It's not a fact answer. It's an opinion, and it's an awareness question, and it's an awareness answer. One of the most important things you can help your buyer understand about the seller disclosure notice are how most of these questions are awareness questions. So good point. You know, it makes you all kinds of reasons why they don't know. Now, if it's something where it's fairly obvious and they should have known and people have told them about it and he just didn't go check it out, that may weaken his position. But there's so many things that sellers just frankly don't know about as you work through that process. Now, continuing the seller disclosure notice, the Texas Realtors, some of the questions, of course, we have in both the TREC one and this one, all those added questions dealing with flood insurance that was added in the legislative session, which is why the new seller disclosure came out in September of last year. So the other things that are in here, which I think are very reasonable kinds of questions. One of the things that we ask in the Texas Realtor report are about inspections, which is section 10. This is one of those areas that I continually have a problem with because it's now required by law. The 4-page TREC form doesn't have anything in there about, having had inspections or having knowledge of inspections. Not there at all. But remember, in seller disclosure, seller can't lie about it. So if they have previous, what if a seller says, well, I think so, or I don't know, maybe whatever. They get to answer. They just can't lie about it. If they've got previous inspection reports, they cannot answer no, because they're lying about it. And lying on the seller disclosure will get you in all kinds of trouble, one way or the other. The other, as you go through this, dealing with insurance, question section 12, and this makes the exception other than the flood damage. Seller, have you ever filed a claim with the insurance company? This is a different question than 13. And if the seller has ever filed a claim with the insurance company, then you disclose this. I think that's an important disclosure. I think buyers would want to know that. It's not in the TREC form. The TREC form doesn't ask about if the seller has filed insurance claims or not. One of the challenges, though, sometimes the seller will make an inquiry to their insurance company on something, and the insurance company may, in fact, even send an adjuster out, take a look at it, and determine. And the insurance company says, well, it's a repair issue and it's so minor that it doesn't even come close to meeting your deductible. So we're not going to do anything. We're not going to do anything at all. But the insurance company may still have tagged that as a claim. And so the seller needs to say, yeah, I filed a claim and say yes or no. And then down in the comments, you can say, here's why it is. 13 is that other issue of filing a claim, getting money from the insurance company, and not spending it on the repair for which the claim was made. If you say yes on this, you have to explain it. Why did you file a claim? Why did you get the money? Why did you not spend it on the problem? Because this could potentially impact on a buyer's coverage in their insurance if their insurance company finds out a claim was made and $20,000 was paid out for a particular problem, and the buyer's insurance company says, well, we're going to insure you, but not for that. So there may be an exception. That's an insurance issue. We don't know for sure what they'll end up doing, but that's something we need to work through. So you need to kind of help your seller think through this and really be able to come up with a good answer to it. Section 14. This is not asking if they're working smoke detectors. It's asking if they comply with Chapter 766 of the Health and Safety Code. Well, as far as I know, we've only had one seller who could knowledgeably answer yes. And he happened to be the fire chief. in that city. He was familiar with Chapter 766. All the typical seller knows is whether they have some or not. So the answer for the seller should be unknown. I don't know if it complies or not. I don't even know what Chapter 766. Now, if you'd asked me about 765, I could have really told you about that, but I don't know about 7. You don't know. So just help them. Every little thing they do that can help with their accuracy can make a huge difference. Now, one of the things that helps us, you look right above the signature blocks. Signature, the seller acknowledge that the statements in this notice are true to the best of seller's belief, and that no person, including the broker, has instructed or influenced seller to provide inaccurate information or to omit any material information. This is an important statement. Seller is saying, my agent didn't help me with this. My agent didn't explain things to me. My agent didn't say, here's what I want you to do. What you will do as a listing agent, you'll get the seller's disclosure notice from your seller. And what you're going to do is you're going to look at it for completeness to make sure they filled everything out and not just left a whole lot of things, nothing checked at all. But you want to be very careful, because if you review it for content and you have a conversation with your seller may then testify that they completed the seller's disclosure notice with the assistance and with the help of their agent. We don't want to ever be there. We can't have us be part of this in the property code and here in the common law and Separate Trade Practice Act. All of it relates to this document is the seller's, no one else, only the seller. It's why you will avoid, like the plague, ever making statements about the condition of the property. Because if you do that, you've now represented something about the property, you're now responsible. So you can't go down that road at all as you work through it. So that's a very important statement there that you need to have an awareness of in working through this. And additional notices, these are things everybody should be pretty comfortable with, be familiar with as you work through it. You've got a nice little disclaimer there dealing with square footage and so forth, which you should be pretty comfortable with how we want to work with that. Then item 7 on additional notices, says again that the brokers have relied on this notice as true and correct. In other words, when the seller gives it to us, we're going to presume it's correct. We're going to presume he's not lying to us about anything, that they're giving us their best information, their true thing as of the date of that notice. They're saying, here's what I know. And that's a really important disclaimer in situation. Now, one of the services that we have for you as agents is Seller Shield. And one of the emphasis in Seller Shield is the seller's disclosure notice, which is such an impact on potential lawsuits after the fact. It kind of creates an E&O for the seller up to 2 years after closing. There can be some different timelines in it. But we're registered, all of our agents are registered. So you should provide the opportunity. There's a one-page form on the Seller Shield website. When we have, I think we've got it on our intranet. You should provide this to the seller and say, if you want to use this, here's the opportunity and here's what it costs. Pay it now or pay it at closing. If you don't want to use it, sign here. So we've got documentation. We've given our seller the opportunity to make use of that. Questions on that part? Question on the seller disclosure?
Bob, if they use Seller Shield, do they still also need to fill out this PAR form also?
Which form?
The seller's disclosure notice?
Oh, yeah,
from
yeah,
PAR?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, using Seller Shield simply, in fact, using Seller Shield simply helps them after the fact, but Seller Shield is going to expect the seller to have completed an accurate seller disclosure notice. So using Seller Shield doesn't in any way eliminate responsibility of the seller to accurately and completely disclose their knowledge and condition of property. Yeah. But after that, now, as you
And Bob,
question.
Bob, did I hear correctly that on Seller Shield, it would be best to offer that option to your client? And if they decide, no, I don't want that, is it declined or acknowledged that they saw the information but chose
Yep.
not to use it?
Correct. There's a one-page form that they can use to say, thank you very much, but no.
Okay,
And you want to have that for your file.
all
Absolutely.
right. Thank you.
Now, there is a, in dealing with disclosures and things that we need and work through, any questions so far on the seller disclosure before I move to another thing in dealing with surveillance issues? You've got a one page in your packet there. Let's see if I've got it here. Somehow I must not have gotten this in with the packet when I scanned it. Wait a minute. Okay. Here it is. This is a page out of our Texas Realtor Listing Agreement, which we use. And paragraph F. And this deals with the surveillance issue. One of our agents got a call from a buyer's agent, and the buyer's agent asked us, the listing agent says, we need to know, my buyer needs to know, I need to know, does your seller have surveillance equipment where they can, record voices, voice activated, or video or whatever? And the buyer's agent got a little aggressive and says, you have to tell me that because it's against the law if I do certain things. So you need to tell me whether or not that surveillance equipment is there. Now, sometimes buyers agents get really aggressive about it. So in the listing agreement in paragraph F, we advise the seller to consult an attorney consult an attorney before using any type of surveillance device in the property to record or otherwise monitor prospective buyers without their knowledge or consent. And we also tell them, by the way, you should be aware that buyers may be taking photographs of your property with or without your consent. So we're telling the seller, this is the legal issue. You're not going to give your opinion on whether it's legal or not. You're not, so, well, hey, it's my friggin' house. I own it. I live here. I'll decide if I want to record somebody or not. You don't, nobody else gets to tell me that. Well, we don't know. We're not going to give my opinion on it. We're going to say, hey, you need to talk to an attorney. You need to know, in fact, whether or not you can do that or not, because the laws are significant. And especially if we've got somebody coming from another state, some of the laws are different in other states. And so, we need to make sure that our seller has consulted an attorney. And the other thing we need to make sure as we talk to our seller is say, you need to consider if you're not going to have any devices, then we want to make sure you have given us permission that when we're asked, and we will be, when you're asked by a buyer's agent, we can say no. Because you, the seller, have told us no, don't have any voice activated, we don't have anything at all. And the seller needs to give permission to say no and give that answer. Now, there's a little bit of a shade trick here. One of our agents had a seller. He didn't have surveillance equipment. But in the house, two-story house, underneath the stairway was a little room. And the seller, when the house was being shown, would hide in that room and listen to people. Well, he didn't have surveillance equipment. It was him. I don't know where we go with disclosing that. Oh, by the way, the seller is in that little room kind of peeking out, watching you. I don't know. So the things that can be happening out there can get kind of crazy. But if they say to you, and I wanted an email or something, the seller said, nope, I don't have any of that. Don't intend to do it. Don't have it. Okay, then you need to give me permission to tell a buyer's agent when they ask and give the answer no. Now, if they have surveillance equipment, one, you need for them to understand you need to talk to an attorney to determine if that's okay or not. And I also need for you to give me permission when asked to tell a buyer's agent, yeah, he does have surveillance equipment. He's told me it's okay to tell you that. We need to have that. We need for that to be there, but we need permission from our seller, because if we disclose that without our seller's consent, our seller could come after us. But it's an area that's very sensitive, and it's a legal issue that we can't give our opinion on whether it's okay or not okay to do it. And so we need to make sure that we're on top of that. Questions on the surveillance issue. This is going to become more and more. And sometimes there's no surveillance stuff in the house, but they've got a ring system on the doorbell.
Yeah.
And that ring system can be recording or listening to buyers standing outside the house talking about the house. So we've got all kinds of semi-complications of dealing with this that we've got to
Hey, Bob.
really be able to work through. Question? Yes, ma'am.
Hey, it's Bonnie.
Hi, Bonnie.
On MLS, there's a place to put surveillance devices present. If an agent doesn't look at that, isn't that their responsibility? I mean, if the listing agent puts it in there, but the buyer's agent doesn't look at it, it's there. The information
I agree.
is there.
There's a responsibility. I agree. There's a responsibility on the buyer's agent side to review that, to look at that information, and many listing agents will be diligent in preparing that or not. There are two situations you need to understand. One, if you've got a buyer who doesn't have an agent, they don't have that information. Second, because you've got a customer copy, I don't know that that question is on the customer copy. It might be, but I haven't looked at it. The other thing is the seller may, at the time of the listing, not have anything, but have added it after the fact because something happened. They're now concerned. What you want to do is make sure that you have a good conversation with your seller, and when they've changed what they're doing there, you go in and amend the listing in MLS to show that information and get permission from your seller to disclose that. Because you're exactly right, they can happen. We do tend to rely a lot on buyer's agents to do their due diligence and to make sure they pay attention to things. I mean, one of the things that we tell our buyer, and it's in the buyer rep agreement, is tell the buyer, hey, you need to expect you're being monitored, you're being recorded. Whether you are or not, you just need to expect that's the case. Every buyer, when you show them a house, say, oh, by the way, don't know if it's going on here or not, you just need to be prepared. Here's what could be done. So they're cautious about what they're saying because they can totally blow the deal on the house they really, really want by saying unkind things. That makes sense, Bonnie? Are we good with that?
Yep.
Okay. Now, we've gotten into multiple offer situations again. Certain price ranges much more than otherwise. And as a listing agent, most of the time, I would say easily 80 to 90% of the time, you're going to know this is the kind of property that's going to have a lot of interest, and you're probably going to be in a multiple offer situation. You need to prepare your seller for that, educate your seller for that, help your seller understand if we do get into that, there's certain steps. And we will have another, as we're having this happen, in one of our future classes, we'll spend a significant amount of time on the multiple offer process, including helping the seller create criteria to decide which offer is really the most likely to close, things of that nature. But there's a form in here, it's a Texas Realtor form, that in my opinion is a really good form. It's a very handy form. When your seller is in a multiple offer situation, a couple of things we're absolutely 100% clear on. Your seller can never counter on more than one offer. Because if more than one offer is accepted, seller has ended up in a contract, primary contract, more than one buyer. Can never happen. Can't have that happen. So this form is not a counter offer, and it says so down towards the bottom of this form, which says this is not a counter offer. Probably still on the market, seller can obtain and accept other offers. And the other great thing about this form, seller can send this out to 2 or 3 different buyers with different information. Doesn't have to be the same information for all the buyers. One buyer it might be price, the other buyer it might be a closing day, another buyer it may be the title company, different types of things that you're going to deal with. So the seller can send this off and say, you know what, if you would submit another offer and make these changes, I'd more favorably consider. No guarantees here. It's not a counter offer. I'm not saying I'll accept your offer if you do these things. I'm saying, you know what, I'll look at it a little bit more favorably. This is a great way to get buyers to make changes and come in with another highest and best offer. It's a very handy form. You should be comfortable with it, and you should be in a position to really make use of it, to work through it. Now, as we go through this whole multiple offer situation, or property that may be about to become multiple offer, you're the listing agent. And you get a phone call from a buyer's agent. And a buyer's agent simply wants to know, hey, I've got a buyer really interested in your property, and my buyer wanted to know, do you have other offers? Well, kind of what's the status? What's going on? Very reasonable question. As a buyer's agent, before you wasted a buyer on a particular property that may or may not be able to buy, you probably would ask that. As a listing agent, you'll need to have a conversation with your seller, because your seller is the ultimate decision maker in what you disclose, even though in paragraph 11 of the Texas Realtor Listing Agreement, the seller gives us permission to disclose the existence of other offers. We already have that permission, and it's in the listing agreement. So when a buyer's agent asks you that, say, whatever the answer is, say no, say yes, yes we do. Now, we understand the risk. We say, well, yeah, we do actually have five other offers. What's the risk for the seller when you tell a buyer's agent that? What's your risk? What could happen with that buyer?
They move on.
Yeah, they move on. You lose them entirely. Just runs them off. So there is a risk there. Now, a principle all the way through everything we do. You can never lie to them. You can't say, well, no, because you want to encourage more and more offers. You've got to tell the truth. If you have authority to tell a buyer, says, yes, we do have other offers. You don't have to say how many. So yes, we have other offers. You don't ever have to get into the terms of the offer. And in fact, shouldn't. Says, yes, we have other offers. It will help the negotiation environment move forward if you go ahead and say, yeah, as a matter of fact, this is a really good piece of property, as you, a good buyer's agent, would already know. You already know in this market, in this price range, a lot of interest for this property. You already know that. So you shouldn't be surprised when I say, yeah, we've got other offers. You shouldn't be surprised at that. And you want to kind of move that forward. Now, be prepared to address the next questions from the buyer's agent, who wants this buyer to have the best shot, because this buyer's already lost 3 houses and they want to lose another one. And so the buyer's agent is going to say, you know what, help me out here. All these other offers, they above list price. How much is what's it going to take for us to get the deal? And so you kind of go through that situation. Don't go there. Deal with it in your own personality, but I like to smile at, yeah, I know why you're asking that, but I can't help you. We're not talking any terms. What my seller wants me to tell you is to encourage your buyer to make their final and best offer. Don't make an offer as a point of negotiation, hoping to get a counter from the seller and kind of work through it, because, the seller may be in a position where you're ready to accept some offer, go through that process. So buyer's agent, you know what kind of property you got, you know what's going on in the market, you know what your buyer's willing to do, make your best offer on it, but we're not going to have any conversation on the term. Now, and we'll talk about this in that multiple offer class, but I'll tell you who have the most problem with this. Agents who are in our office, who you're good friends with, are going to work you. Oh, come on, Bonnie. We're good buds. You know how bad I need this deal. I got that Mercedes payment coming up. I got to have this deal. Help me out here. Help me give me some hints. You don't have to tell me hard numbers. Just give me some hints. What's it going to take? We give our own agents the hardest time, because we kind of work off those relationships. Don't do that to one of our fellow agents. And then when you have it done by one of our agents, just kind of laugh and smile and say, you know what? Were you in that class where Bob talked about that? Yeah, I hear what you're doing, but you know what? No, can't go down there. Can't go down that road. Because they will, you know, so, maybe not in our office, but a good friend in another office, you know, they'll work you. It gets a little bit of a challenge. So this is a great forum to use. And when you get to questions about other offers, get this thing moving going. Now, occasionally you'll have a seller who says, I do not give you permission to disclose other offers. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's fair. I think it pits people against each other. I've been down that road. I don't want that to happen. So agent, you're not allowed to tell buyer's agents when they ask if there are other offers. Even if there are, you're not allowed to tell them. You don't have that permission. Now, you're going to accept, that's a lawful instruction of the seller. You're going to accept that. Your challenge is you need to go ahead and tell your seller, you know what? I respect that. You get to make that decision. Here's what you need to know. When I say to the buyer's agent, you know, I'm sorry, my seller has not given me permission to disclose offers. Well, you just did. They're clear that if there were not other offers, you simply would have said no. The fact that you didn't say no tells that agent there are other offers. And the seller needs to understand that's what's going to happen. Will happen. That's okay. It works through it. Now,
Hey, Bob,
question. Yes, ma'am.
can't tell. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I can. Go ahead.
This,
Question?
okay, the form in number 2 is fine, where the seller says you can come in and resubmit. But number 2 to me is really an unopened question. I mean, not question, but it says that you are invited to submit another offer, which seller may more favorably consider if. So this is not saying they'll take your offer, but if you do these things, don't you see how the buyer can say, hey, I've done all these things?
No. That's okay. Good question, Chantel. Let's look at the language. And it's really important language. And there are 2 points in here. One, which seller may more favorably consider.
If.
Not if you'll do these things, we'll accept it. More favorably consider. More important at the bottom, this communication and invitation is not a counter offer. Property remains on the market. Seller may consider other offers, and accept another offer. We're being very clear to the buyer. If you want a shot at this, here's what you need to do to even have a shot at it. If you do all these things, doesn't mean you're still going to get the deal, because 2 or 3 other buyers may have done this and more. But the seller will more favorably consider. The language is really important, and I understand your point. In fact, it's the reason I really like this form, because if you don't use this form, what you're doing is having texts and emails and conversation back and forth with the buyer's agent, and a buyer's agent walks away with an understanding that that last thing you, the listing agent, said really meant it was, oh yeah, we got a deal. Yeah, my seller likes that. If you'll do that, we got, and that happens, and it happens way too often. Don't have those conversations. Use this form so it's clear to them. Here's the communication. Here's what we're doing. It's not a counter offer. Do these things to have any chance for our seller to really like your buyer and maybe consider doing a deal. But it's a consider. It's not a fact. It's not a guarantee. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's just,
So when you got the buyer and you get this from the listing agent, explain this to the buyer. Here's what you need to understand is happening here. Seller liked your offer. Otherwise, he just absolutely rejected it. He likes it, but he says, here's some things I want you to consider. And so buyers agent, you need to understand this is not a counter offer. These are just some things that that the seller would really like to see. And so if you're willing to do these things, you might be in a little better position. Do what? Question?
that wasn't me. That was someone else.
Okay.
What was that?
Bob, can I ask you a question on this topic?
Yes, Jeannie. Yes, ma'am.
How are you? We miss you. Okay, after the fact, after the sale, are you allowed to tell other agents and appraisers the terms? Because I had a weird listing that was so hot the winning buyer paid all the commissions and everything, but it appeared that the sales price was lower. So other agents were asking, why did it sell for lower? Am I allowed to tell them?
Great question. And who has to give us permission to do that is the seller.
Okay.
So the seller needs to say, yeah, okay. Now, appraisers, we will cooperate with appraisers however we can. However, the appraiser has the information in MLS. So they see the price, they see whether there's seller concession, they see those kinds of things. What you kind of alluded to there, Jeannie, is a buyer's agent whose buyer made, in their mind, a better offer than what actually ended up closing. And they're kind of saying, you know what, what's going on here?
Correct.
Is it because my buyer's from Oklahoma? Is that why you wouldn't sell to them? I mean, you know, what kind of discrimination we got here? And so it could be a little bit of a challenge working through that. So you want to be very, very cautious, because what we know and understand, there are many factors to determine which offer is actually ends up being done. Sometimes it's a relationship between the buyer and the seller. Sometimes the seller just frankly likes that buyer for whatever reason. Maybe that buyer's kids play soccer with the seller's kids. You know, there are all kinds of reasons that it could happen. The other thing is when we're helping our seller with their criteria on which property they might want to end up, which offer they want to accept. The most important criteria is certainty of close. Mm-hmm. It could be that another buyer made a much higher offer that when the listing agent and the seller really look and says, you know what, there's no hope for this thing ever closing. It won't ever appraise out. There are too many possibilities here, too many challenges, too many things that keep this thing from closing. So I want a really sure deal. I want a good, safe offer that has a very high probability of closing. So we know from our side, there are a lot of reasons why a seller would accept and end up closing on this contract that appears to be lower than another one, but we understand the question. In fact, we've asked the question ourselves. Many of you have had situations with buyers, and sometimes because your buyer pushes, your buyer says, whoa, how come it's sold for less than what we offer? How come we didn't get it? And so you go through that conversation with the seller, the listing agent. The listing agent can only give you terms and all those things with permission of their seller. Same way, you can only give up that information. You know, if there's any concession or anything going on in the transaction that an appraiser needs to know that we don't have an MLS yet, talk to your seller and say, we want to help appraisers out. We want to have a good relationship with appraisers, give them good information that causes us to have good comps. So we may do things with appraisers that we wouldn't do with another agent. That makes sense?
Thank you.
You're welcome. I miss you too. Okay, so even Jack. Okay, so one of the other scenarios that we've had a challenge with, I want to talk a little bit about the registration agreement between broker and owner. It's a Texas Realtor 2401. We most commonly use this with for sale by owners. You've got a buyer, you found the house of the buyer, buyer's found the house, however it happens, and it's for sale by owner, and the seller just looking to save some money in the deal. And generally they're willing to pay 3% to the buyer's agent. And what you're going to do is you're going to register your buyer with this seller. And on page 1 of the form, you'll register your buyer with this owner, with this seller, and you're going to put in there the commission of what it is that you want the seller to pay. On page 2 of this form, we have a conversation about agency and representation. 99% of the time, you've got the buyer, you're going to register your buyer with a seller, you're going to check off 7A2 will represent prospect only. For Texas Realtors, prospect means the same thing as buyer. So you're going to represent the buyer only. Even though this form has the correct statutory information required for written consent for an enemy relationship, and it is possible that you could check off number 3, have an intermediary. It'd be very, very unusual Because, you know, one of my challenges, I don't want you to be that neutral agent in the middle. And if it's a for sale by owner and you represent the buyer as a client, the circumstances in which you would also take the seller's client are just incredibly rare. But you need to always have a conversation with me. If you use this form, if you want to check off 7A3, we need to have that conversation before you entertain even thinking about doing that. So this form, it can be used in those situations. Now, we can use this form in a number of scenarios where you're prospecting, you're working for sale by owners, you're working expired, you're working all those kinds of things. And this happens in expired, just like for sale by owners. They're really not willing to list yet, but they like what you're saying, and you've established a rapport and relationships, and you may have a buyer that you can register with them going through the process. And so this form can be used to help you establish a relationship with the seller. What often happens is when you use this form, register a buyer with them, even if that deal doesn't work out, you've begun to establish some credibility with that seller. You're in a much stronger position to now list their property, because you're probably the only agent who's worked them from the level that actually has documentation that you've gone through the process to get them signed off on this form as you kind of work through it. Just as a little bit of an aside, I did have a question. I think maybe Laura had gotten involved in it about, no, it was Shalene. You have a for sale by owner with a sign in the front yard, but they're on the do not call list. But they've got a sign in the front yard with their phone number. Can you still call them? Only if you're calling them to set an appointment for an actual buyer. If you have a buyer, because the whole reason they've got the sign in the front yard and the number on it is for buyers. If you've got a buyer client that you're going to represent who's interested in that property, then you're going to go through that process and you're going to do that. You can call them under those circumstances. I'm calling you and tell them, I understand you're on the do not call list. This is not a prospecting call. I'm not trying to list your property. I have a buyer that I want to register with you, and I want to show your property. Under those circumstances, you can call that seller who's on the DNC list. If you're just out prospecting and don't legitimately have a buyer, don't play games. Don't do it, because they can file a complaint and the penalties get pretty severe if you work through that. So this particular form, everybody kind of semi-good with this, with the use of this form and how we can make use of it? Question on that? Now, one of the things that I failed to mention on the seller's disclosure notice. I don't think I did. Sometimes I forget. You've got the seller. They've done a seller's disclosure notice 2 months ago and hadn't closed yet. But the seller now has new information about condition of the property. And so the question comes up over and over again, does the seller need to update the seller's disclosure notice? Well, the Texas Property Code does not require the seller to physically update a previously completed and signed seller's disclosure notice. They do require the seller provide that information to a buyer. There is no requirement in the property code for how the seller does that. Texas Realtor has a form, JR has a form, it's a one-page form on updating a seller's disclosure notice. And if it's not a huge number of things that seller has to update, this is a great form to use where the seller can say, yeah, here's new information I've got. You know, we after the fact had some foundation work done or had a roof put on or whatever. They can use that to update it. It's really handy because the seller does have to make sure they disclose new information, because the concept is if the seller has new information that causes the original seller's disclosure notice to no longer be true or some form of misrepresentation, then the seller needs to correct that. And they can do that with that one-page updated seller's disclosure notice. We're going to work through that. Question on some of that? We good so far? Any other things that we want to talk about that you guys are in the middle of? I've had a couple of situations recently where I'm happy to bring them up and talk about that's not in these specific areas. But I also love it when you guys have something say, wow, I just had this and we haven't addressed this yet, so what do I do? So if you have something, this would be a great time to kind of let me know as you work through it. I'm giving you a chance to unmute yourself and kind of work through that, deal with it.
So Bob, I have one. This is Laura.
Yes, ma'am.
Sale falls out. You've got an inspection from the other agent, even though you didn't ask for it, and the new buyer wants a copy of the inspection.
Okay, what are you going to do?
That's my question. What would you like us to do? Can we still use that disclosure that we have notice before you give the inspection? And I would assume it would be a seller decision.
Not really.
I would understand.
Okay, so here, it's a
but you
great
still have to
question.
disclose.
It's a great question, and we have this challenge on a regular basis. Texas Realtors, in their FAQ, their legal section, they actually address this question. The first question that comes in a situation like this, and the Texas Realtor Legal Hotline has addressed this, and they've got a whole list of legal hotline issues. Does the seller have to give that inspection report up to that new buyer? We're clear, no. Law does not require that. However, Texas Realtor says it's probably best practice to give it up. In fact, what the seller probably would do is use the Texas Realtor one-page form, update sales disclosure, and say in there, says, seller now has new information from an inspection report from a previous buyer, and that inspection report is attached. Because what happens is you've got an 80-page inspection report. Seller says, I've got to go through 80 pages and correct all the things in my sales disclosure on the things that just, I was there and there's an idiot inspector. I can't believe how stupid he is. He came up with all these crazy, and now I've got to, well, let's just give the next buyer the inspection report. So here's the information that was in the report, and I'm letting you know with this update that information in my previous sales disclosure did not include this information, but here it is. That's best business practice for a seller to be able to give that information up, because as many of you know, some of those reports are very onerous. They just have a ton of information in there, and your seller goes ballistic. Especially if you're in a tenuous situation with your seller, they're sitting there going, my gosh, just one more thing. And they'll look at you as creating the problem, not the law. And so you've got to create an easy, simple way for them. Say, hey, here's the best business practice. We want you to understand the property code, not Keller Williams Plano, not Bob Baker. Property code requires you to give up this information. And here's the easiest and best way to do it. Let's give them the inspection report and let them worry about it. Now, what you need to understand is a very aggressive buyer is going to take that inspection report and use it and just go through the seller's disclosure notice and compare everything and say, wow, man, here's some new stuff that's in this now. I know you just gave it to me, but wow, are you, and they're going to use that against the seller. It can be a challenge, but that's the best practice, giving that up rather than trying to redo a whole seller's disclosure notice and going through that can be an enormous challenge.
We need to get the advisory notice before we give that, or that should just automatically go?
Get the what?
There's an advisory notice that you put together a while back for prospective, if you have the buyer and or thank you for being interested in our property, or is that no longer needed?
Or you said, it's good. There are a couple of them. One, right. if the seller is going to provide the previous inspection report to a buyer, we do have an advisory that tells this buyer, we'll only give you this report if you agree that you're not going to use this inspection report in lieu of doing your own.
Right.
Because that's a risk. We don't want that to happen. And so when you get that request from a buyer's agent, you'll say, okay, yeah, not a problem. We're happy to include that in our update, but here's a form we need for you to sign. And you're going to let them know this is what the seller's requiring. So it says we don't want this buyer to use this inspection report. This also applies, by the way, sometimes a seller will do a pre-listing inspection. And so he'll have an inspection report that he'll give up to a buyer. He needs to make sure that same advisory gets signed off that buyer, because what will happen is a buyer will look at the seller's inspection report and say, well, that's a good report. In fact, that's an inspector we might have used. So there's no point in us paying for inspection because there it is right here. Well, we don't want that. Now, a buyer can make a decision to not do an inspection, but we want them to sign that form where we've advised them, you ought to do your own inspection. You shouldn't look at this one in lieu of, because you have no recourse against this inspector, period, regardless. So yeah, great point. And you really do have to address and deal with that as you work through it.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Real quick question for you.
Yes, sir.
Just follow up to Lars, and that is, what's the name of that form or notice that needs to be sent out to buyers from the seller? And
okay, now clarify, Brian, which form?
The form that you send when you're sending the inspection report.
Are you going to send it prior to? You send it before you give them the inspection report, because you're going to send the inspection report along with the one-page update sales disclosure notice form, the tax realtor form. But it's an inspection advisory form. It's in our intranet in all of our forms, and it's an inspection advisory form. There are actually two of them, depending on the circumstances. But you would want to give that to the other side prior to. Now, you've got to have your seller on board with this. It needs to be a seller decision. Your seller needs to understand the risk they have of a buyer using the seller's inspection, even a previous buyer's inspection, in lieu of doing their own. That's a risk to the seller. And your seller needs to be on board. Yeah, we're not going to give them this inspection unless they sign off on this. You're right. And so you'll be required. Yet another thing?
Yeah, one additional question is, do you provide that inspection report on MLS, or do you provide the update to the
seller? If you put the inspection report in MLS, they've got it and they haven't signed off on our advisory.
Got it. All right.
You can put the advisory in MLS so they can pull down the advisory, sign off on it, send us to them when you send them the inspection report, along with the update form.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So the timing of that is what becomes important. Everybody kind of have a sense of that?
Thank you, Bob.
Yep, thank you. Work through it. One of the things that we're going to do in a future class, we're going to talk a little bit more about systems and dealing with what you do when a certain thing comes up. Kind of in that direction. You should have, if you don't, our agent hotline, 972-646-0717. Maybe I can put it in chat or something. This is a hotline that's available to you weekdays till 9 o'clock at night, and then on the weekends till 9 o'clock. We've got 4 agents who rotate answering the calls. This is a really handy thing for you to do. What I would request of you, before you make the call, you need to have some information already available. This is especially true if you call me. If you're going to call me, and I'm okay with you calling me, you can suspect that because I get a lot of calls, I'm going to have a little higher level of expectation. You're going to call me. It needs to be a good call. And here's some things I need. I need for you to have really thought through the question yourself. Before you ask somebody else for the answer, I want you to think through it and make sure, wow, okay, I really don't have an answer. Think through, for example, what's it relate to? Is this the transaction rules? Is the contract itself? Don't call me if the answer to the question is in the contract. And you're asking me because you haven't read the contract. Not a good call. Now, I'm not telling you don't call me, but that's not a good call. So you need to have read it. The other thing is, I need some information about what's going on. I need to know who the agent is on the other side, who they're with. If we're already in contract, title company, lenders, the more information I have about all of those, the better position I'll be in to advise us and to know how we can move forward on certain kinds of things. So if you'll do that, it'll make it a much, much better call all the way through as you work through that and kind of work through it. Is everybody kind of seem on board with we probably do need to have a class that spends a little bit more time on multiple offers, or everybody said, oh, Bob, that's not a really big deal anymore, so let's don't worry about it. Give me some
I
feedback.
think
about
there's
what-
still, Bob, I think there's still so much more to cover. I like where you're going with this because it's now, we're in a multiple offer situation, so we need to know as much as we can about those things.
Okay, so understanding the rules and how we work through the process back and forth, I've got a list of 9 criteria that you share with your seller, that seller uses to decide which offer is the best and you know why and how, that kind of thing. So we can do that in one of our future advanced classes. Probably spend an hour on just dealing with a multiple offer scenario, because I do think it's going to continue to be
Right.
that challenge to work through it.
And I'm afraid to call you, but I want that hotline number anyway.
Okay, 972-646-0717. You'll get one of the 4 agents. Usually during the day, 9 to 5, it's Marcia Levine. And in the evenings, we've got Scott Scribner and Nick McCoy and Joe Martin's rotating. And it goes to 9 o'clock at night and goes to 9 o'clock on Saturday and Sunday. And it's the great thing about these calls, these are really good agents. Laura Kellogg used to be on it before she left and came back, and we're very happy she came back. So she understands the workings and how this works. These really give you some really good information. And if you have a call to the hotline and it's something that goes beyond what they want to deal with and it comes to me, you've taken that first preliminary step. So that's a good, you know, these agents who are on the hotline are very good about saying, okay, I understand the question. We need to take that to Bob, you know, because it's deal at a different level. Now, let's be clear. We're not taking it to Bob because Bob is any smarter than anybody else. I'm not. I've just had more experience.
You're so modest.
I know this last 2 months ago, July, I celebrated 53 years as a broker. I've seen a lot of deals. In fact, when you have a question for me, chances are I had it last week. Now, sometimes you'll get something I say, wow, that's a legal issue. That's a great issue. And I'll know who we need to call to get more information. And that's good. And that's a good call. But I welcome them. We don't want to become enablers. We want you to think through things, not just always say, well, I don't have to worry about it or think about it. I'll just call somebody. We don't want that. That causes us to become enablers, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah.
We want to be your resource. We want to have your back, work through it, so that you can spend your time building your business. You can spend your time, you know, lead generating, working your buyers and sellers, and getting the closings, and work through that. So that's our objective. That's where we really want to be with all this. Any other great questions or anything? We're working through all this.
I have a question about the FSBO, using that form to register your buyer with that seller. How much pushback, if any, are you seeing? Let's say you have your residential buyer representation agreement signed, and under 11, you put in, or a person will put in the percentage of the commission should the other party not be willing to pay for it. That means then the buyer would be paying for it. And
That's correct. So here, it's a great question, Deborah.
So how do you avoid not losing out on your commission, and how you protect yourself?
First of all, you may not be able to avoid it. When you've got a buyer client or a buyer rep, and a for sale owner has come to their attention, maybe they found it, hey, if you look at this house, for whatever reason, you'll contact the seller. You'll say, I've got a buyer, I've got a form I'm going to send you registering this buyer, and I'd like for you to pay me the 3% that's typical on the buyer side. And so I said, no way, Jose, at all. I'm not paying anything. I've got a hot piece of property. If your buyer wants to buy it, then they're going to have to pay you. You're going to go back to your buyer and say, okay, you need to know if you pursue this property with me, the seller's not going to pay me. Under the buyer rep agreement, you're going to need to pay me the 3%. Now, your buyer, a lot of variables, depending on the relationship with your buyer, how you got your buyer, how important this is, not is, so forth. You may have a relationship with your buyer. In fact, we just had this before the COVID thing, actually, before all that happened. And our agent had a buyer that he was getting ready to fire, getting ready to just no more. and the buyer had one last deal. But whoa, this house over here for sale, I love it. Can you see if we can? And when our agent called, the seller said, no, I'm not paying anything. Your buyer's gonna have to pay. And so when our agent told the buyer, I said, well, I don't think that's right. I thought that you really told me the other side would always pay the commission. I wouldn't owe you anything. Well, you never told them that, but that's what they thought they heard. In a case like that, our agent said, you know what? I think you're right. I think it's not fair. I'm going to release you from our buyer rep agreement. You're free to pursue that seller on your own, and good luck, because that seller is going to screw you just big time. I mean, you're going to lose out on this deal because that's what happens. But then release them. If you've got a situation because your relationship with the buyer or whatever, that your buyer just is not going to pay you, can't pay you, won't pay you, then your option is to release them. Let them pursue them on their own. Work through that.
Okay, thanks.
Makes some
Thank you.
sense?
Yes, it does. Thanks.
Guys, you've been great. I thank you very, very much for being here. I so look forward to when we can finally see each other real in person.
Yeah.
All that kind of thing. Any last quick questions on anything?
No, we appreciate you. Thank you so much, Bob.
Well, thank you guys. And I'm going to cut out the share thing here. I've got us. And if I don't have anything else, we're just going to leave. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Call us done. Thank you very much. Bye.
Okay.